I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.
Yes.
So today, Rob, we're looking at a text that I actually read way back in 2013, a couple of years after it came out, when I was studying in Taiwan and applying to some grad programs. I actually wanted to be a student of the author of this program. Her name is Jing Tsu. She's, I believe, still at Yale in the Chinese program there, and she has a fascinating book called Sound and Script in Chinese Diaspora.
So you said you wanted to study with her. Obviously, that didn't work out. Was that because you couldn't do it, or you just changed your mind?
I just bombed the interview for Yale.
Okay, well, that'll explain it then.
Best mistake of my life.
You would never have had this $1 million podcast
I think
that we're doing.
The kids at Yale are way too cool to do a podcast like
Way
everybody
too cool.
else in academia.
Yeah, at least in the U.S. There's lots of this stuff in other countries.
That's true, yeah. I mean people in academics in the U.S., I think, are there's just an issue with this kind of need to feel like you're doing something highfalutin.
So cool, right? It's funny because even in France, where you would think the French would be colder or more serious or whatever, you should see the number of intellectual podcasts go through Radio France. There's just thousands of things. And guests all the time from major universities sitting and chatting about
They're
stuff.
much more comfortable talking with the public.
I think too in France there's a tendency to want to see academic things sort of a part of public life. Not like everyone should be able to listen to a lecture by Michel de Certeau, but people who get PhDs go into the government. They do actual practical jobs and things.
And part of our podcast is kind of trying to do that, right? Like we're talking about literature. Hopefully, we like to think in a way where, folks can understand us. Anyone who has an interest can understand us.
Now, having said all that, the book we're talking about today would not be one of those I would say to just anybody, hey, you should totally just read this. A couple of, we've talked about Jonathan Spence and some other writers that are frankly very approachable. I mentioned David Hawkes. This is a very theoretical book. It's a very well-written book.
It's one of the best written theoretical books I've read in a long time in Chinese literature. Rob, would you? I mean, you've read a little bit more theory than I have.
I agree and don't agree. I think maybe when it came out, yes. I've read books since that I liked more, that I thought did more than this one did. This is an interesting book.
Before we talk about the book, let's explain what the book actually is.
Yes, let's do that.
Jing Tsu's Sound and Script takes us on a journey through different kind of manifestations of the Chinese language.
National language as it's kind of percolated outside of China. She discusses some in the Chinese mainland, some of the kind of adventures of the Chinese language in the Chinese mainland as well. But her focus is definitely on Chinese diaspora. She's done a lot of research on Sinophone literature. She looks at language reform and failed language reform in Taiwan. Her best chapter, I think, is the chapter on Lin Yutang, which Lin Yutang, he was this very famous writer, both in English and Chinese. I actually think he was more famous in English. I think he was, yeah.
He was nominated for the Nobel Prize twice. He wrote a lot of essays to an American audience about China. So My Country, My People, Moments in Peking.
A Moment in Peking,
A Moment in Peking. That was a novel, if I remember correctly.
Which I read a long time ago, and I don't even remember much about it.
But she actually kind of... Jing Tsu's perspective is a little bit different. As a literary scholar, she's more of a historian of language coming from the field of literary studies. So she actually takes us through Lin Yutang's most famous invention. He actually invented a typewriter for Chinese that was something that people thought really couldn't be done. He invents this in New York in the 1950s. So he's got an Italian engineer helping him design stuff. He's working in Chinatown and somewhere in the suburbs. And he makes this typewriter, which essentially does what folks said couldn't be done. They thought that for a Chinese typewriter, you would have to have essentially a key for every character. And he breaks it down. He actually reinvents a way, he reinvents the way we think about typing, whereas before it was one key equals one letter, which works for alphabets, for half of the world's languages, it doesn't work, right? Like
Right.
Arabic, you have to have cursive, Hindi and other Sanskritic derived scripts. It doesn't work. And
Right.
for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean too, I believe, although my Korean linguistics is, that kind of conceptualization of the typewriter just doesn't work. So he comes up with a system where he's actually like breaking the characters apart into their constituent components and typing them. It's really amazing, and it's a incredible, ingenious work of engineering.
Right.
And she kind of takes us through how that situates the Chinese language in relationship to this discourse of global language. And one of her points is that, before Lin Yutang, lots of people were saying, Chinese it's not ready for the big leagues, right? Like, even though you have 1 billion speakers of this language and it's, like one of the most successful languages in the world, it's just not prepared to be a modern language because it doesn't fit on a typewriter. And Lin Yutang says, well, you're so constrained in your understanding of what a typewriter is. So he rethinks the typewriter and he rethinks what language is in the modern age, which is also a rethinking of the Chinese language. That's kind of her point in that chapter.
That's her point in that chapter, and it's sort of her point throughout, which is that to think of a language as something that you have and you do things with forgets the fact that in many cases you don't have it until you've done something with it. So in this case, for example, the reason I like that chapter on Lin Yutang so much, and I can talk about why I wasn't a huge fan of some of the other parts of the book, but is that it's a reminder of how old the idea of technological mediation of language is. So having a typewriter that is able to type Chinese doesn't just allow you to express what you would have said anyway. It changes how you use the language entirely. This is not even a difficult point to make. I mean, Chinese users today who rely so much on cell phones and the ability to express themselves in Chinese on cell phones understand that completely, right? What you're able to do technologically with the language informs what that language actually even is. And so this is what she's kind of playing with, is this idea of, okay, so let's say we have something called Chinese, a standardized language, right? Let's just say that for the sake of argument. Now, the moment you start to do stuff with it like this, it's not the same thing anymore, if it ever was in the first place, right?
You're kind of dancing around something that I want to just hit at. So you're playing with the idea that the medium is the message, right?
Marshall McLuhan.
Right, which Marshall McLuhan is the most famous scholar of communication. He's a Canadian, very famous. I have a lot of issues with him. Jing Tsu actually kind of tackles Marshall McLuhan a little and points out that much of what he said about Chinese, which was completely ridiculous. He has large sections of his books where he talks about Chinese. He knows nothing about Chinese, but he does have this really fascinating discussion of how the medium actually affects what you're communicating. So the way I explain the concept to my students is, think about Twitter, right? Like, do you ever feel like all American politics has just become every moron out there spouting whatever they want to say, like whatever comes to the top of their head, they immediately just say it? How much does Twitter and how it encourages you to just write and publish whatever you're thinking at that particular moment, how much does that create the way that American politics and really lots of other politics and internationally are occurring today? How does that create this sense that all of these people aren't being reflective? They're just being morons who are saying whatever comes to the top of their head. The medium itself, that is Twitter, is actually constructing its own politics. Is kind of, I think, how, if Marshall McLuhan was alive today, how he would think of it. And Jing Tsu's kind of making that point with the Lin Yutang chapter on the typewriter. He constructs this way for the Chinese language to be modern, which is kind of your point about Jing Tsu's point, right?
Right, and it's also going to change. Well, I mean, just think about it. It's not even hard to imagine, right? I mean, if you have to use a pencil and paper to write something versus being able to use a computer, you're clearly going to write a whole lot more on a computer because it's a lot faster once you learn how to use it, right?
And you're going to be able to kind of distribute that differently.
Right. And all of this ties into it. What she's
her overall point in this book is, as I mentioned, related to this, in that to think of a national language as some sort of standardized, fixed thing that brings everyone together. So if you can speak Chinese, if you have access to the Chinese language, you on some level have access to just Chineseness, is problematic because of all the different ways having access to that language actually changes the language.
One point I wanted to make, Tian Xiaofei, who is a scholar at Harvard, has a book called Taiyuan Ming and Manuscript Culture, the Records of the Dusty Table. I think Tian Xiaofei is making a point that's quite similar to Rob, the point you're making, and the point that Jing Tsu makes in Sound and Script, which is just the medium creates the message. And Tian Xiaofei is looking at how the medium of manuscript culture, that is people not printing things out, boom, 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 kind of up and down the kind of mechanized way we think of print culture, where you just kind of like set it and then print out 1 million copies. But Tian Xiaofei is writing about Taiyuan Ming. So Taiyuan Ming is, he's writing, I think, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, 3rd and 4th century CE. But we don't actually really know what he has to say because his poetry has been transmitted by hand so often that there will be like 3 different versions of the same poem and we don't know which one is correct. And the reason that is because manuscript writers, when they were copying it, they felt free to just change stuff oftentimes. And so that's, again, another way that, like Lin Yutang in Jing Tsu's book, the medium is the message.
I think you're a bigger fan of this book than I am.
It's probably, I wanted to work with her. So.
Right. And tell me if this is how you read this too. Maybe you're reading it differently. It feels much more a part of the sort of Sinophone literature camp in that there's a sense of really wanting to buck against this idea of a standardized Chinese language being a good thing. Like she oftentimes in this book positions the idea of a national language, and this is I would say a fairly standard argument. This isn't particularly unique.
A standard argument in Sinophone.
Yeah, is to say the reason there's a national language is because Western nations in intervening in Chinese history in the 19th century sort of made it necessary to articulate some version of Chineseness. Like, we're different from you. Well, how are you different from me? Well, we have this language, and so that we're going to standardize it and have this thing that make us all Chinese together, right? And the implicit argument being that if this hadn't happened, we would still have rich local dialects and nothing like a national. There would be no need to have a national language at all.
When you say if it hadn't happened, you're meaning the encounter with the West.
The encounter with the West. Yeah. There's obviously a lot to be said for that argument, but it's I find it sometimes kind of unsatisfactory. There's a long-running, not really even debate, but a problem for any sort of language group or language groupings in questions of access to the rest of the world, right? So she has a sentence here a little later on when she's talking about Lin Yutang's typewriter and the kinds of political things he was dealing with. So she says, setting the Chinese character to a new type was intended to give China a weighted entry into a world of polarized Eastern and Western influences. At the same time, the attention being paid to the Chinese language's outward success through a parallel shift subsumed the internal differences of tongues under a nationalizing and standardizing imperative. It's a lot of words, but this idea of subsumed the internal differences. So basically all the unique local things were sort of mushed and just kind of sucked up into this idea of a national language. But at the same time, and this is one of the things that Lin Yutang was dealing with, doing that is also what gave writers like Lin Yutang access to the rest of the world. If you're speaking Hokla, well, A, it's a local dialect that not even many people in China can read. B, certainly nobody outside of your area can read it, including the rest of the world. So do you want the rest of the world to read what you're doing or not? And this is a classic problem in many language groups.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of articulating an argument that Shishume makes, that essentially Mandarin is the
the language of the version of Chinese that white folks learn, and therefore it's somehow like less legitimate, less native. I'm not entirely sure how Shushume would frame it, but I think Jing Tsu is going beyond Shushume's point. I think Jing Tsu, I admire her writing a bit more, and I think that she is not suggesting just that this encounter with the West is what's driving the creation of a single standard. It's a variety of things. I think she would definitely say that's one of the things that drives the Chinese, the creation of Putonghua in mainland China, or Guoyu as it was first conceptualized and then moved to Taiwan. But that's certainly not the only thing. And I think you can point out that there is this movement in the Ming and the Qing early on to have this form of vernacular. They're kind of slowly moving towards it, but there is a direction that we can see.
Right.
So I don't see Jing Tsu saying like the kind of straight up that this standardized form of language that we have today, that is Mandarin, Putonghua, is a result of only of the encounter with the West. She's much more complicated than that.
Yes, although yes and no. Yes, more complicated than the argument you just presented there. I don't know if I'd say more complicated than Shushume, but what gets frustrating to me about books like this, arguments like this, is that there's absolutely nowhere to land. Like this sentence here, which I think is interesting. If the Chinese language is what keeps Sinophone writers together as a global community, it is also the medium they learn to manipulate in order to hold themselves apart. Reading it feels sometimes like you can never really get a straight answer. So, does China have a national language? Yes, and also no. Does China have a native language? Yes, but also no. Does the Chinese language bind?
Sentence, Rob.
What now?
I don't get any of that from that sentence. You're looking at page 13 of Sound and Script.
Right. This is just an example, but it keeps people together, but it also drives them apart. It's an interesting. Let me finish my thought, and then you can by all means criticize me. It's an interesting thought, and it's an interesting book. But the reason it gets frustrating is I don't know where it's going. The Chinese language is a national language, and it's also not. It's native, and it's not. It's what brings people together, but it's also not. And so after a while, I'm like, what are we even talking about then? Are we just endlessly critiquing, or is there a position that we're going to occupy?
I think you're maybe looking at this book the wrong way, and I think it's because your expertise on the subject of translation and language is allowing you to not see the forest for the trees. Don't bite too hard into kind of that discussion. I think that you can look at Jing Tsu's Sound and Script more as she's using those kind of debates, which you're right, she is kind of fudging her answers, but she's using those debates to discuss these really interesting things like Lin Yutang's typewriter, Chen Jitong's concept of world literature, Taiwan's language reform. So it's just more of a framing device. Don't get hung up on it. Enjoy her interesting historical examples, and if you find the sort of theoretical engagement that she does interesting, by all means dig into it. I'm not as theoretical as you are, Rob. I took her arguments for what they were, but I was more focused on the kind of the implications and what was inside the framework that she sets
Well, and if you
up.
read it almost like an anthology of sorts, like each individual chapter has its own separate thing happening, it's a much more interesting read. When I come at it through the introduction and what's supposed to be the overall argument, I go, I don't see where this is going, right? But like you say, and we've talked about it earlier, the Lin Yutang chapter, the Chen Jitong chapter, super interesting details and examples from history, and I'm down with that. But the overall sort of, it almost feels like reading a book where someone had a couple of individual journal articles, each of which is fantastic, and sort of just needed an umbrella to put them under, and that's the introduction.
Well, I mean, to be fair, all first books are that.
A little bit, could be, yeah.
They're just good or bad journal articles that you put together, stapled together, and then you have to come up with a framework to explain your dissertation to your advisors. I think that's what she's doing. She's got these amazing examples. She comes up with a theoretical framework for it that, Rob, you didn't really like. I didn't like or dislike.
You ignored it.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, she's coming out of Berkeley. She's a professor at Yale. So Yale is I think a fairly theory heavy environment in general, not necessarily the Chinese department particularly.
Most Ivy League programs are.
Maybe, but
Columbia certainly is.
Yeah, but you definitely, so you have to have that kind of theory underneath you.
If you want street cred, you got to have theory.
If you want ivory tower cred, really more like it.
You know what? This will be my closing thought too, because we got to wrap up. Reading the book, though, sometimes makes me wonder if the author really wanted to make some of these theoretical interventions. Would she have been happier really just telling the story of Chen Jitong and Lin Yutang? Because I've had this happen a lot myself, is to find a thing that and Chen Jitong in particular, I actually wanted to write one of the earliest ideas I had for a dissertation was Chen Jitong, right? Fascinating figure. But I didn't really want to make a theoretical argument about Chen Jitong. I just wanted to write about Chen Jitong. And reading this, I wonder, was that her too? Like, would she have been a lot happier just writing a history of Chen Jitong or Lin Yutang? And the theory was sort of a necessary evil? Or this is really her bread and butter as well? Pure speculation, whatever.
I think that's a good place to end it, Rob. I don't think we can really say either way. I mean, unless she wants to come on the program.
Wow, that would be exciting.
This is an invitation right there.
Do it.
But yeah, I think this is a fascinating read. You're right, Rob. It is kind of, you're swimming in the deep end on this one. So it's something that folks who are interested in literature should pick up. I think if you are kind of interested by what we've talked about, but not really wanting to do the theory thing, I would just say skip the introduction.
Go right to the Lin Yutang chapter.
Go get into some of the meat, into the body chapters.
Agreed.
And I think that you'll be fine. That's a good place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.